Hello, welcome. It's the second installment of Fighting Fukuyama, where I argue with Fukuyama. So, in this section, we're going to discuss Fukuyama's claim, and I'm going to play the clip in a second, that there's a general tendency when you see a society which has a growing middle class to push that society towards liberal reforms, or at least a high demand for liberal reforms. And you could say, in general, give the society a more liberal democratic character, demand more transparency, less corruption, more rule of law, and so on and so on. And he uses the example of the Arab Spring here. He's indicating when you have a kind of growing population of kind of especially with young people, younger kind of urban, more westernized demographics, that you're going to have a push for this. And he's using the Arab Spring as an example. So I'll play the clip.
A globalized world, a reasonably open capitalist economic order that has been hugely productive, and we've seen massive declines in global poverty in places like India and China, and we've seen the rise of middle classes in many parts of the world. Now, there is a long-standing tradition that goes back to people like Sam Huntington and Barrington Moore that argues that there is a close connection between the rise of middle classes and democracy. It's not inevitable. There are many middle classes that turn against democracy, but by and large, once you reach a certain level of education, own assets that the government can take away from you, there tends to be a greater inclination to want to participate to some degree in political rule, which is the starting point. It's not the completion, but it is the starting point for democracy. And part of the reason that I think this third wave of democratizations has occurred in places like Brazil or Turkey or Indonesia is because of that underlying wave of prosperity and the kinds of social changes that it has brought in its wake. And there's no guarantee that that kind of economic growth will continue. We could go back into a protectionist phase as we did in the 1930s, and a lot of those gains could be lost. But I do think that there is a certain social and economic mechanism out there that is pointing us in this direction. Now, because the argument in the end of history was really that for a society that aspired to be modern, there was really only one, broadly speaking, form of political and economic organization, some form of liberal democracy and some form of market economy. And clearly, if you look around the world today, not everybody does that. And there are alternative models. And the question I think that begs is, if you accept this kind of Marxist framework where you do have a progressive evolution across different societies towards different forms of social organization, is that direction pointing towards an alternative model that would in some sense be higher, more just, more sustainable, more productive along a lot of different dimensions than what we have now in the developed democratic world? And I think we can go over several of them. I actually think that there's only one that has a remote chance of being considered a serious alternative, and that's the China model. But let's run through a couple of the ones that are out there right now. Start with Islam. We have Islamic republics in Iran and Saudi Arabia, in other, Islamic monarchies. We have Islamic government in a number of places. Is this the future of mankind? I sort of doubt it, because it seems to me that anyone that is not already culturally Muslim has very little interest in moving in that direction. But I think the Arab Spring actually points to an interesting phenomenon, which is that, prior to that uprising, it was very common to say that there was either a Muslim or an Arab exception to the third wave, that there was something about the cultural background of those societies that would not allow democracy to emerge, that they were too passive, they were accepting of authority, and so forth. And I think if there's one thing that the Arab Spring proved, that's not correct. And in fact, I think you can see a lot of the same mechanisms operating in places like Tunisia and Egypt that operated in Ukraine or in Turkey or in Brazil or other places where you have a rising middle class. Those revolutions were driven by exactly that same class of relatively young, relatively educated, urbanized middle-class people, as similar revolutions have been driven in other parts of the world.
So, first we could start off basically first by saying, well, we have 10 years hindsight from when Fukuyama made this claim. And none of these Arab Springs, particularly went very, very well. They didn't end up turning all these countries into liberal democracies and so on. So we have to ask why. But I think that there's a more general question here about like what is the middle class, and like as a kind of sociological and historical thing, like what is it? What is its nature? What is its kind of universal characteristic? Because you have a growing middle class in China now, and many of them study in Western universities and so on. You have to wonder, they don't seem to be moving in this kind of Western liberal democratic way, even with the growth of that middle class. Like, I'm not saying that middle class hasn't changed China. I think it's radically changed China. And actually, in many ways, we could even argue that it may have changed China for the worse. How do I put it? But like, it's. I think it is clear. I think it is clear that they're not. That this growing middle class in China hasn't led towards a liberal democratic country, and it hasn't led for the demands for a liberal democratic society and so forth. If you look at China, if you look at their social credit system, which I'll discuss again in this video a bit later, but like, these are not like things that would be very acceptable in a kind of classical liberal democratic world. These are not things that would be considered acceptable. But it seems like the middle class in China doesn't care about these things. It doesn't really. So Fukuyama's claim here that there is some sort of intrinsic. Okay, he says it's not inevitable, but he says that there's some sort of intrinsic inclination towards a liberal democratic demand for reforms and liberal democratic character when you have this growing class in China. Kind of shows us quite empirically that is not the case. And then we're going to have to see that with countries like India and other Asian countries and so on. Who knows, Africa maybe in the future. The trajectory and character of modern development and integration into global capitalism, which can, often lead to a enlarging, inflated middle class. It doesn't seem to be working out the way Fukuyama had previously predicted it would. But like, I don't want to just simply say, well, look at these countries, they're not all like, liberal and democratic, and there's no sort of serious push for that despite having a middle class, therefore, end of story. I even think we should turn the table around and have a look at the West itself, because I actually think that there is something universal about this growth of a middle class, that there is a universal characteristic. I just disagree that it's a kind of democratic characteristic. So you have to ask yourself, like, what is this universal middle class characteristic? And I would say, rather than higher demand for rule of law, rather than more political transparency, more than more sort of political participation, more in kind of enlightened reason and so forth. These liberal characteristics, enlightened Western characteristics that we've assumed are intrinsic to economic and social development. I'm gonna say I don't think it's that. I think it's secularism. I think actually that the intrinsic similarity we see between different variations of a growing middle class is a move towards a kind of secularism. Obviously, we've seen this in the West. I don't have to point this out. It doesn't seem to me. I know there's there's elements of Confucianism in China and so on, but like it seems to me, for all intents and purposes, they're a relatively secular country who has no problem. They don't have any serious hesitations about the use of technology, the use of kind of growing bureaucracy, these kind of secular forces. Which may have began in the West, but could easily be, exaggerated by other countries like China. They don't seem to have any problem with this. They don't seem to me to be a particularly like spiritual or religious people. And I think that it seems to me, and having lived in like London, for example, and having friends from all different countries that are kind of from the middle class, it seems to me that whenever you have a growth of the middle class, you have either a full-on secularism, or at the very least you have the diluting of religious practice. Some people still, they go to church every so often, or whatever, but they don't really have a kind of more kind of fundamental religious practice and religious belief that their grandparents or great grandparents would have had. And this may explain why, for example, Islamic countries have less of a middle class than Southeast Asia and Western Europe and the US, because they've got because they've held on to certain religious tendencies in a way which is somehow intrinsically antagonistic to the growth of this middle class, or to certain characteristics which emerge with the growth of this middle class. So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking when you have the growth of this middle class, and when you have this enlarging of this group we call the middle class, there tends to be three different characteristics which get either completely destroyed or get diluted, maybe even re-educated. And those are threefold. The first one is a working class. What we've seen in the West, actually, I know Fukuyama is aware of class problems, but I don't think he takes it seriously enough, because what you see in the West happening in the 20th century is basically a move to having a kind of politicized working class who have their own character and their own sort of manner and their own kind of their own more distinct values and character and manner and so on, being sort of turned almost re-educated and dissolved into the middle class, and the parts that haven't been educated and kind of dissolved into the middle class have largely become very marginal, irrelevant, being stripped of any sort of political power, and also I think culturally it's kind of scapegoated. Like a lot of working class characteristics, mannerisms and characteristics have been, the source, or not the source, but the target of attack by kind of middle class re-educators and middle class moralists who are going to, like Me Too and political correctness and all this kind of stuff. It's extremely hostile towards working class. Towards working class characteristics, not just within the working class, but within their own groups as well. Like if you're in the middle class, but like your dad or your granddad was working class, and you've got some, especially if you're a man, and if you've got some sort of like working class tendencies, behavioral tendencies or whatever, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble with just everyone around you within middle class circles, institutions, social circles, workplaces, everything. You're just going to find yourself being hounded the whole time. You know? And trust me, I have personal experience with this. Right, this is just like, you know. So we have the expulsion, we could say. We have the expulsion of working class characteristics. What else do we have? Well, we have the expulsion of religious belief as well. As I was saying before, whenever you have a middle class, you tend to get the view of religious practice to be, you know, even barbaric, maybe, like, you know, backwards, irrational, it's peculiar, alien, strange, blah, blah, blah. You know, think of the new atheism wave that occurred after 9/11 and the whole war on terror and so on, you know, which was intrinsic also to the attempt to kind of force, you know, the kind of liberal democratic values upon other people. It always expresses a hostility to cultures and civilizations that have more visceral and more fundamental religious belief. There's always a diluting or an expulsion of that religious belief. That's also somewhat intrinsic to liberalism as a whole, because if you go back to liberalism from the very beginning, Hobbes, Locke, and so on, you see a suspicion of sectarian. You see an aversion to sectarian conflict. So it's inevitable that liberal societies are going to be, you know, suspicious of kind of enthusiastic religious belief. But you know, but it seems to me that even in, you know, middle societies with this middle class that aren't liberal, it seems to me that you get something similar actually. So okay, so those are so you've got the expulsion of the working class character, you've got the expulsion of the religious character, and of course, you know, you have the expulsion of the noble character, you have the expulsion of the aristocratic character. Wealth, power has to be separated from. I'm thinking here of Christopher Lasch, for example. You know, wealth and power has to be severed and separated from a sense of duty and a sense of honor. You know, so thymotic impulses, the willingness to fight, the you know, kind of blood and soil. Claims over sovereignty and honor and respect, all of these sort of kind of more noble characteristics have to be expelled. These are barbaric, these are irrational, these are unhygienic, and so on and so on. So I think this is consistent, actually. I think this is a consistent tendency around the world when you have this emergence of the middle class. Now, countries will use nationalism in order to try hang on to some sense of like character or social sensibility, which isn't like this totally cowardly, self-serving, slimy like tendencies. Because the problem is, like, once you get rid of all of these. Once you get rid of the kind of discipline and durability and the kind of honesty of working class character, once you get rid of the kind of faith and piety and so on of religious character, once you get rid of the honor and the courage and the sense of dutifulness of the aristocratic character, you're kind of left with nothing then, aren't you? You're kind of left with just these kind of slimy, self-serving consumer people. And then you're like, well, like what do we need then to kind of call ourselves human or to keep things together so that things don't just, like, the moral fabric of society doesn't just completely fall apart? Well, you know, nationalism emerges. So, you know, then you have nationalism emerging, but then it's like, well, we often aren't happy with how that looks, right? And in the last video, I used Ukraine as the example. It's like, you know, we're expecting the Ukrainians to be these brave, you know, freedom-fighting people fighting for their own nation's sovereignty, but we don't really want to address how that looks, because sometimes that will turn into kind of ethno-nationalism and so on, and you know, it doesn't, you know. So basically, you've got, whenever you have this emergence of the middle class, you have this stripping and expulsion of these certain characteristics. And I actually think that the thing it leads to at the end of the day is a kind of hyperconformity and a kind of total risk aversion. It seems to me that societies, when they have a large middle class growth, that they tend to take on these tendencies of like hyperconformity, and one would wonder like how the Nazis got away with what they got away with. You know, we've kind of always wondered this in you know, since World War II. All sociologists, cultural theorists, and so on have at some stage wondered. Psychologists, everyone's wondered like how this happened. Well, you know, that looking at these tendencies as the growing middle classes and the expulsion of certain characters and certain practices, religious, working class, and aristocratic. If you expel these things, you know, are people just really easy to manipulate? Then are they just like really easy to control? They really are, like, or it's not even that they're easy to control. They just don't care. They just don't give a shit. It's like, as long as things are working out for me on a day-to-day basis, couldn't give a crap. Do whatever you want. No one's really looked at this very honestly. And I think you could say the same thing about the West today with like cancel culture and all this kind of stuff, that it's just this hyper conformity. It's like people with no principles. They've got no principles. Like the easiest, safest thing at any given moment, they will do it and screw anyone else who says otherwise. Like, and I think with China, with the kind of social credit score system, you know, we in the West like to tell ourselves, you know, think like these false stories, like, oh, you've got this evil communist government in China who are forcing these strange illiberal mechanisms on people. Well, actually, no. Like, these mechanisms may be intrinsic to what happens when you have a large growth of the middle class. So I would say that actually it's not a liberal democratic characteristic that is inevitable when you have an emergence in the middle class. It's a hyperconformity. It's a total loss of principle, and it's a total risk aversion. We don't want to take any risks. We don't want to get in trouble. We're just going to do what we have to do to get by. And by getting by, it normally means not paying your bills, but it means, you know, having a second house or something, right? Like getting into some elite university, which all the Chinese do today. All the Chinese, when they're sending their kids to fucking elite, you know, Western universities, and it's like, you know, they're teaching their kids from a young age, you know, you're going to do what you have to do to get into that university. It's not, you're going to have to do what you're going to do to, you know, put food on the table. You know, these aren't humble goals. These aren't humble versions of getting by. These are extremely arrogant versions of getting by. So actually, when you think about it, all societies in general, all modern societies in general are going to encounter and have already encountered, although we haven't framed it this way, this problem of a growing middle class. Because we automatically see it as a good thing, and you know what I mean. It is a good thing in the purely economic sense. It is a good thing that that you have more people in the middle being involved rather than just people on top controlling everything and everyone else on the bottom. Sure, that is a good thing, but the problem is, it seems to me that in modern societies, the way that that comes about is by stripping us of everything good about ourselves, by stripping us of all of our characteristics, whether those be the religious characteristics of faith, the working class characteristics of, you know, discipline and durability, whether those the noble aristocratic characteristics of honor and so forth and duty. We're left with nothing. And this constantly happens over and over and over again. And I actually think if you were to take an honest look at non-Western countries who are going through a growth of the middle class, you're probably going to see something similar. So that's my challenge to Fukuyama on the middle class. That's a pretty solid left hook and a pretty solid body shot for Fukuyama. I think I won round 2, so let me know what you think.